Daniel pulled out a brown envelope from his jacket. The way he held it, like it was just another business paper, made Grace's stomach turn. "Grace, I think we both know our marriage hasn't been working," he said in a cold voice. "You've been focused on staying home and your little hobbies. But I need someone who understands success. Someone who can match my ambition." The words hit Grace like punches. She heard people gasp around her. Her mother started to move toward her, but Grace raised her hand to stop her. "These are divorce papers," Daniel continued, walking toward her with Sandra following behind him. Sandra had a nasty smile on her face, like she was watching her favorite movie. He handed Grace the envelope. When their fingers touched, Grace looked into his eyes, searching for the man she married 5 years ago. But she saw only a stranger. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Everyone stared at Grace, waiting to see if she would cry, scream, or fall apart. But what nobody knew, what Daniel had never bothered to find out, was that Grace Adeyemi was also Grace Oakley, the founder and CEO of Zenith Empire Corporation. The same company behind the 10.5 billion Nigerian nairas deal Daniel believed would make his career. She had built her business empire quietly over 7 years, keeping her maiden name for work and her married name at home. She wanted to know if Daniel loved her for herself, not for her money. Now, standing at her own baby shower with divorce papers in her shaking hands, Grace had her answer. Sandra stepped closer and laughed. "Oh honey, don't cry too much," she said with fake sympathy. "Daniel needs a woman who understands business. Not someone whose biggest achievement is choosing baby room colors." The insult hung in the air. Grace saw her sister Blessing's face turn red with anger. She saw her mother's hands turn into fists. She saw friends looking at Daniel with disgust. But Grace also saw something else. She saw exactly who these people were when they thought they had all the power. Daniel cleared his throat, uncomfortable now. "Look, Grace, this doesn't have to be ugly," he said. "You'll get the house, a fair settlement. You can focus on being a mother, which is what you're good at anyway." He pointed at her pregnant belly, like that was all she was worth. He had no idea that the woman standing before him had built business networks across 6 countries. That she had created jobs for over 50,000 people. That she was worth more money than he could imagine. Grace's hands trembled as she opened the envelope and looked at the divorce papers inside. Tomorrow morning, Daniel would walk into the most important meeting of his life. He would expect to sign the contract that would make him rich and famous. But instead he would find his pregnant wife sitting in the CEO's chair. What would happen when Daniel discovered the truth? Grace looked at the divorce papers in her hands. Her tears fell onto the pages, but her mind was already thinking clearly, already planning what would happen next. "I'll sign these," she said quietly, her voice stronger than anyone expected. "And tomorrow, after your big meeting, we'll talk about the settlement." Daniel nodded, looking relieved. He thought she was giving up without a fight. He had no idea that Grace's calm was not weakness, it was strategy. Sandra wrapped her arm around Daniel's, practically glowing with happiness. Together, they walked toward the exit while guests moved away from them like they carried a disease. They left behind a baby shower that had turned into a funeral for a marriage that died long before anyone knew it was already gone. Grace's sister Blessing rushed to her side. "Grace, I can't believe he—" "It's okay," Grace said softly, placing a hand on Blessing's arm. "He made his choice. Now he'll have to live with it." What nobody at that baby shower knew was that 3 months ago, Grace had already suspected Daniel was cheating with Sandra. She had sat in her private office at Zenith Empire Corporation headquarters in Victoria Island, the top floor corner office with huge windows overlooking Lagos, and made a difficult decision. She told her legal team to move forward with Daniel's deal. To give him everything he wanted professionally. To let him believe he had earned this success through his own hard work. All while knowing that the final signature on that contract would be hers. Her assistant and closest friend, Tund Bello, had argued against this plan. "If you think he's cheating, Grace, why reward him with the contract of his career?" Tund had asked, his voice full of concern. Grace had shaken her head, her hand resting on her belly that was just starting to show at 3 months pregnant. "Because I need to know, Tund," she said quietly. "I need to know if Daniel loves me, or if he loves what I can do for his career." Now, standing in the destroyed remains of her baby shower, Grace had her answer. Daniel had chosen ambition over love. He had chosen a woman who fed his ego over a wife who had quietly built opportunities for him. He had chosen to humiliate her publicly instead of talking to her privately like adults. The knowledge settled into her bones like ice. But beneath the pain, something else was growing. A cold determination that had built a trillionaire empire from nothing and wouldn't hesitate to protect itself. Tomorrow morning's meeting would reveal everything. It would destroy every illusion Daniel had built about his own importance. It would show Sandra that her victory was actually her biggest mistake. Grace's mother came to stand beside her. "My daughter, are you all right?" Grace looked at her mother and managed a small smile. "I will be, Mama. Tomorrow everything will be clear." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her hand on her growing belly, feeling her baby kick. This child would know their father's name, but would be raised with values he had never shown. She thought about the past 6 months, listening to Daniel practice his presentations at dinner, hearing him take phone calls with her company's representatives while she pretended to read, watching him grow colder as success seemed closer. He had been preparing to meet with her company all along, never knowing his wife owned it. Grace picked up her phone and sent a message to Tund. "Confirm the meeting for 10 a.m. Make sure everything is ready." His reply came quickly, "Already done." "Are you sure about this?" Grace typed back, "He made his choice. Now I'm making mine." As dawn broke over Lagos, Daniel was in his apartment with Sandra, celebrating what he thought would be his greatest triumph. He had no idea he was about to walk into his worst nightmare. Would Daniel recognize his mistake before he destroyed everything? Or was it already too late for him to save himself? Daniel stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. He had barely slept, but excitement kept him awake and energized. Today was the day. The 10.5 billion Nigerian Naira's deal with Zenith Empire Corporation. The deal that would make him a legend in the Nigerian business world. Sandra came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You're going to be amazing today," she whispered. "Once you sign this deal, everyone will want to work with you. And that pathetic woman crying at her baby shower will realize what she lost." The words should have made Daniel feel powerful, but something bothered him. Something about the way Grace had looked at him yesterday when she agreed to sign the divorce papers. Her eyes hadn't looked defeated, even though tears ran down her face. He shook the thought away. Grace was just a housewife. What could she possibly do? The elevator doors opened on the 47th floor of the Zenith Empire Corporation building in Victoria Island. Daniel and Sandra stepped into a reception area that screamed wealth and power. Marble floors shine like mirrors. Expensive art hung on the walls. A receptionist with a professional smile greeted them. "Mr. Adeyemi, welcome to Zenith Empire Corporation," she said, her voice giving nothing away. "The CEO will see you shortly. Please wait here for a few minutes." Daniel nodded, trying to look calm even though his heart raced with anticipation. This moment was the result of 6 months of hard work, presentations and negotiations. Sandra squeezed his hand, her eyes scanning the luxury around them with barely hidden greed. She was already imagining herself belonging in places like this. What Daniel didn't know was that behind the frosted glass doors, Grace sat at the head of a 30-foot conference table. Her pregnancy barely showed under the expensive Armani suit she wore for important meetings. Tund stood beside her, holding a tablet that displayed the divorce papers Daniel had served yesterday alongside the 10.5 billion Nigerian Naira's contract that needed only her signature. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Grace?" Tund asked quietly, genuine worry in his voice. "Once we bring him in here, once he sees you in that chair, there's no going back." Grace nodded slowly, her hand resting on her belly where her baby kicked gently. "He made his choice when he handed me divorce papers at my own baby shower, Tund," she said, her voice steady but carrying pain underneath. "He made his choice when he brought his mistress to humiliate me in front of my family and friends." She paused, looking at the divorce papers on the screen. She remembered the weight of that envelope in her hands. The sound of Sandra's cruel laughter. The way Daniel had looked at her like she was garbage. "He had every opportunity to choose differently," Grace continued. "But what he doesn't understand yet is that I gave him chances, and the consequences of his choices aren't my responsibility anymore." Tund nodded and tapped his tablet to signal the receptionist. The frosted glass doors opened. Daniel walked into the conference room with Sandra half a step behind him. They both expected to see corporate executives in suits, lawyers with briefcases, maybe some board members. What they saw instead made Daniel stop so suddenly that Sandra bumped into him. Grace sat at the head of the table, watching them calmly. Daniel's face went white. His mouth opened but no words came out. His brain struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. His pregnant wife. The woman he divorced yesterday. The woman whose tears Sandra had laughed at. Sitting in the CEO's chair of the company that controlled his entire future. "Hello, Daniel," Grace said quietly, her voice professional and controlled. Thank you for coming to finalize the Zenith Empire Corporation contract. Please sit down. Understanding crashed over Daniel like ocean waves. Each piece of information he had never bothered to learn about his own wife now came together into a picture that destroyed everything he believed. Sandra stood frozen beside him, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and then pure fear. How had they made such a terrible, terrible mistake? I don't understand, Daniel stammered, his hands shaking as he gripped the back of a leather chair. You're the CEO? You're Grace Oakley, but that's your maiden name. His voice trailed off as more pieces fell into place. Her hobbies, that kept her busy during the day. The way she always understood his business discussions better than he expected. The fact that she never seemed impressed by his career achievements. Grace leaned back in her chair, her hands folded across her pregnant belly. She watched her husband's world crumble with an expression that held more sadness than satisfaction. Yes, Daniel. I'm Grace Oakley, founder and CEO of Zenith Empire Corporation, she confirmed, each word landing like a hammer. I built this company from nothing 7 years ago, 2 years before we met. I've been running it throughout our entire marriage while you assumed I was just staying home planning dinner parties and picking curtains. She paused, letting that information sink in. Sandra's face had gone completely pale now. The 10.5 billion Nigerian nairas deal you've been negotiating for 6 months, that's my company, my contract, and my decision whether or not to sign it, Grace continued. Which means your entire career, your reputation, and your future are in my hands right now. Exactly where you put them when you served me divorce papers yesterday. Daniel collapsed into the chair, his legs no longer able to support him. His entire worldview was shattering like broken glass. Sandra remained standing, her face showing shock, panic, and the desperate realization that she had attached herself to a man who had just destroyed himself spectacularly. Grace, please let me explain, Daniel began, his voice cracking. I didn't know. You never told me. Why didn't you tell me? Even now, facing the consequences of his betrayal, his first instinct was to blame her. Not to take responsibility for never truly knowing the woman he married. Never asking about her life beyond how it affected his comfort. Grace's expression didn't change. I didn't tell you because I wanted to know if you loved me for myself, Daniel. Not for what I could do for your career, she said, each word measured and deliberate. I wanted to believe that the man I married valued me as a partner and would stand by me regardless of wealth or status. She paused, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Daniel flinched as he realized he had abandoned not just his wife, but his unborn child, for a woman who was now backing toward the door. But instead, you served me divorce papers at my baby shower, brought your mistress to laugh at my tears, and told me my greatest accomplishment was picking nursery colors, Grace said. All while preparing to sign a deal with my company, completely blind to the fact that your success was something I had been building for you all along. Sandra's voice suddenly cut through the heavy silence, shrill with panic. I didn't know either. Daniel never mentioned his wife ran a company. He said she just stayed home doing nothing important. Grace noticed how quickly Sandra distanced herself from Daniel now that his value had disappeared. The hand that held his arm possessively yesterday was now empty air between them. If I'd known you were Grace Oakley, I never would have. This is all just a huge misunderstanding, Sandra stammered. But Grace had built a trillionaire empire by reading people, by understanding their true nature. And she saw through Sandra's performance clearly. You laughed at my tears, Sandra, Grace said quietly, her voice colder than ice. You mocked a pregnant woman at her baby shower and celebrated taking her husband, not because you didn't know who I was, but because you thought I was powerless to stop you. Tun stepped forward and placed a different contract on the table in front of Daniel. Not the 10.5 billion Nigerian nairas deal, but something else entirely. Daniel's face went even whiter as he read the opening paragraphs. What had Grace prepared for them, and was there any way Daniel could escape the consequences of his terrible choices? What is this? Daniel whispered, though he clearly understood what he was reading. The legal words spelled out his professional destruction in clear, unmistakable terms. This is the consequence of your choices, Grace answered, her tone businesslike and final. Zenith Empire Corporation will not be moving forward with the original contract. Furthermore, we're withdrawing all partnerships with your firm effective immediately. She watched the information sink into Daniel's consciousness. Partnerships worth approximately 800 million Nigerian nairas annually that your company built their entire business model around. Daniel calculated quickly. His firm would collapse without Zenith Empire's business. and he would be blamed entirely for losing the relationship. But it's not just your career that's over, Daniel, Grace continued. When you served me divorce papers, you triggered prenuptial agreement clauses that you clearly never read carefully. Clauses designed to protect my company and my assets in exactly this scenario. Tund pulled up documents on the conference room screen. Daniel stared at his own signature on agreements he'd signed 5 years ago without a second thought, so confident he would never need to worry about them. According to our prenuptial agreement, infidelity resulting in divorce before our 5th anniversary, which is next month in case you'd forgotten, means you leave the marriage with exactly what you brought into it, Grace explained. Which was approximately 47,000 Nigerian nairas in savings and at least Mercedes you're 3 months behind on payments for. The numbers appeared on screen. Sandra made a small sound of distress as she watched her own future evaporate alongside Daniel's. Her dreams of luxury and status had been built entirely on foundations that just crumbled into dust. Grace stood slowly and walked around the conference table until she stood directly in front of Daniel. For the first time since they'd entered the room, real emotion crept into her voice. Not anger but profound sadness. You called me disposable yesterday, Daniel. You said I contributed nothing to your life and held you back from the success you deserved, she said softly. But the truth is I gave you everything. My love, my trust, my loyalty, and opportunities you were too blind to recognize as gifts. She placed a single paper on the table. Her signature already on the divorce papers he'd drafted. Her agreement to end their marriage now formalized and legally binding. So here's what happens next, Grace said. You'll return to your firm and explain how you've lost the biggest client in their portfolio. You'll face whatever professional consequences follow. And you'll discover exactly how far your career can go without standing on foundations I built for you. Daniel reached for her hand desperately, forgetting everything except the need to somehow undo what couldn't be undone. Grace, please. I made a mistake. I'll do anything. But she stepped back, placing distance between them that represented far more than physical space. Her expression was sad but resolute. The only mistake was mine, Daniel. I mistook your ambition for drive, your confidence for strength, and your charm for character, Grace said, her hand resting on her belly. But I'm a quick learner and I won't make the same mistake twice. She turned to Tund and nodded once. He began ushering Daniel and Sandra toward the door, their protests falling on ears that had heard enough lies. As the conference room doors closed behind them, Grace returned to her chair and sat down heavily. The composure finally cracked as tears she'd been holding back began to fall. Not tears of weakness, but necessary grief for dreams that had died. Her phone buzzed with messages from Blessing, her mother, and friends who'd witnessed yesterday's humiliation and wanted to check on her. Grace smiled slightly through her tears. She'd lost a husband who never truly valued her. But she still had family who loved her, a company she'd built with her own vision, and a child on the way. A child who would be raised to understand that integrity mattered more than status, that character outweighed wealth, and that true power came from knowing your own worth. Would Grace find the strength to move forward and build a new life for herself and her baby? As the conference room doors closed behind Daniel and Sandra, Grace returned to her chair and sat down heavily. The strength that had carried her through the confrontation finally began to crack. The composure she had maintained, the professional mask she had worn, all of it started to crumble. Tears fell down her cheeks, not the tears of yesterday's humiliation but something deeper. The grief of letting go of a dream that had died long before she was ready to admit it. Tund stood nearby, unsure whether to speak or give her space. Finally he said softly, "You did what you had to do, Grace." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know. But knowing it was right doesn't make it hurt less." Her phone buzzed on the table. Messages were coming in one after another. Blessing had sent 5 messages asking if she was okay. Her mother had called 3 times. Friends from the baby shower were checking on her, expressing their shock and support. Grace picked up the phone and scrolled through the messages. Each one reminded her that while she had lost a husband who never truly valued her, she hadn't lost everything. She still had her sister who would fight anyone who hurt her. She still had her mother whose love never wavered. She still had friends who saw her worth even when her own husband was blind to it. And she still had herself, the woman who had built a trillionaire empire from nothing, who had created opportunities for thousands of people, who had the strength to stand up even when her heart was breaking. Grace placed her hand on her pregnant belly, feeling her baby move inside her. This child would never know the version of their father who had walked into this conference room today. They would never see the man who chose ambition over family. But they would know their mother. They would know a woman who understood that integrity mattered more than status. That character was worth more than wealth. That true power came from knowing your own worth, not from seeking validation from people too blind to see it. What will you tell the child about their father? Tund asked gently. Grace was quiet for a moment, thinking. The truth, she finally said. That their father made mistakes. That people sometimes choose poorly. But that those choices don't define who we are or what we can become. She stood up slowly, smoothing down her suit. The tears had stopped now, replaced by something stronger. Not revenge or bitterness, but a quiet determination to move forward. The 10.5 billion Nigerian nairas deal that Daniel thought would make him a legend will become something else now, Grace said, looking out the window at the Lagos skyline. A reminder that how we treat people matters, especially when we think they have no power over us. Tund smiled slightly. Business schools will be teaching this story for years. Maybe, Grace said. But I'm not doing this to teach anyone a lesson. I'm doing this because I deserve better. My child deserves better. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who don't see your value. She gathered her things, preparing to leave the conference room that had witnessed both her pain and her strength. Tomorrow the business world would buzz with rumors about what happened here today. Daniel's name would be whispered in offices across Lagos. Sandra would become a cautionary tale herself. But Grace wouldn't be part of those whispers. She would be busy running her company, preparing for her baby, and building a life that didn't require her to hide who she was or diminish herself to make someone else feel bigger. As she walked toward the door, Tund called out, "Grace?" She turned back. "You're one of the strongest people I know," he said. Grace smiled, a real smile this time. "I'm learning that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about what you do after the breaking happens." She left the conference room and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the polished metal. A pregnant woman in an expensive suit, tears dried on her cheeks but standing tall. Grace placed both hands on her belly and whispered to her unborn child, "We're going to be okay, little one. Better than okay. We're going to be extraordinary." The elevator descended, carrying her away from the confrontation and toward whatever came next. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if Daniel would ever truly understand what he'd lost. She didn't know if the pain would fade quickly or linger for years. But she knew this: she had faced her worst fear, public humiliation and betrayal, and she had survived it. More than survived. She had stood in her truth and demanded respect, even when her heart was shattering. And that knowledge, that certainty of her own strength, was worth more than any business deal. More valuable than any amount of money. More precious than the validation she had once hoped to receive from a man who was never capable of giving it. Grace stepped out of the building into the Lagos afternoon sun. She had entered this building as a woman whose world was falling apart. She was leaving as a woman who understood that sometimes things have to fall apart so better things can come together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, she would go home, rest her tired body, and prepare for the beautiful chapter that was about to begin. We've come to the end of today's story. I hope it touched your heart. Thanks for watching and staying with us till the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?